Welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and I have three books to share with you today. I have finished these three books here. They are each about different people and their life experiences. In some ways, I feel like a lot of books are about that, especially if they're a character study. And there are definitely some characters in these books that I'm going to talk about today, so let's just go ahead and get right into it. The first book I am going to be sharing with you is People Like Us. This is by Jason Mott. This book was just recently published in August 2025. I know, who am I? I almost never read a new release, but I am participating in Herkyed 2.0, and as part of that, I need to read a new release each month. And when I realized this was coming out in August, I knew this was going to be the book. This is a work of literary fiction and is basically the sequel to Jason Mott's book, Hell of a Book. I read that last year, I believe it was, or the year before, and that book blew me away. I thought it was so good. And so I was surprised that I didn't know there was a sequel coming out. And then I looked into it more and realized I'm not surprised I didn't know because this book is a sequel. It has the same characters in it. It does seem to be later in those characters' lives, and in some places it's referenced as a sequel. However, if you look it up on the story graph or on Goodreads, there is no like series heading, there is no book two of, two. There is no mention anywhere on the flap of this book that it's a sequel. So it's kind of a strange situation. To me, it seems clear that it's not being marketed as a sequel, though if you dig around more, you will find it referenced as the sequel. I don't know. I don't understand. Anyway, let me go ahead and tell you what this book is actually about. It is told from two different points of view. One is by an author who is giving a speech at a local school about a recent event that occurred there. His name is Soot. And there is a second author and his perspective, and he is unnamed, but he is on a book tour in Europe for his recent award-winning novel. In fact, one of the things these authors have in common is they both have won the National Book Award, which is really kind of funny because Jason Mott won the National Book Award for his book Hell of a Book. But if you've read Hell of a Book, you will know that Jason Mott likes to kind of have his books repeat his life in some ways. So there is a sense in which both books kind of feel like autofiction of his own experience of being an author. So you definitely have moments where you're like getting into the metafiction world. This book was really fascinating and pretty broad in the number of topics that it covered. It discusses things like gun violence and school shootings, especially in terms of how that relates to American culture, which at the time of filming this, given the different things going on in the news, was really kind of eerie to experience after having read this book. And yeah, in some ways, I feel like sadly, no matter when you read this book, it's going to be like the book is reflecting life and life is reflecting this book. It can get pretty heavy. It's not talking about any specific event. It's more talking about a lot of the preparation and mindset that has to go into your schools and your students and your parents and your teachers, knowing that you're living in an environment where these types of horrific violent events can occur. There are other topics that this book covers that are more related to writing and just the sort of metafiction nature of this book. It discusses authors, writing, the publishing industry, all of which were discussed in Hell of a Book. In fact, Hell of a Book also discusses the issues surrounding gun violence in the US, but it has more to do with police and gun related violence, where this is definitely focusing more on school type of settings and that type of thing, as well as just the prevalence of guns in American culture. There is a lot of discussion about finding a safe place and a place where there are people like you or people like us, and where you can feel safe and comfortable and free in a lot of ways. And of course, in amongst all of these things, there are discussions of racism and race. For me, one of the things that I most appreciated about this book was the discussions that it had and the way it talked about and broached the subject of schools and students and their experience of gun violence. It was done in a very powerful and relatable manner, and also one that was just gut-wrenching and devastating. I think it can be a very difficult topic to write about and read about, and I think Jason Mott, for the most part, handled those discussions really well. He presented things in a very interesting fashion. You couldn't help but stop and think about the implications of what this means. There is a bit of satirical writing going on in here, and in general, I find that Jason Mott tends to blend like magical realism, satirical writing, and surrealism all together. But generally, when he does it, it works really well for me. The only thing is that I did find in people like us that sometimes all of that together was just a bit too much. And I say in this book because maybe it sounds like too much in general, but I found particularly in this book it was too much. In Hell of a Book, you have a lot of the same elements, and I feel like they're handled really well in there. And he managed to pull off a style of writing and a style of storytelling that I don't typically like and really enjoyed. But I did not find that so much to be the case in people like us. I found this book took everything from Hell of a Book and just sort of amped it up more. And so the character that was very fascinating and different and strange and questionable in Hell of a Book just became over the top zany and at times felt like a caricature. I felt like his writing on women in this book just feels like a problem with women in general. And overall, I just felt like there were aspects of this book that felt weird. And all of these things are also kind of addressed in the book. Like the zany character in the book keeps talking about women and at one point acknowledges that he doesn't really know how to talk about women, which I felt like was kind of self reflective of the actual author of the book. But it was also one that made me go, then stop mentioning it and stop bringing them to the forefront because you're right, it's not being done well. And I hate saying that because I do like his other book. And there is also another point in the book where one of the authors is at a speaking event and has somebody come up to him and thank him for writing weird things. And the author's really touched by that. So I feel bad saying that I thought this book was too weird. But it does bring up the point that some people who like weirder things will probably appreciate all the things in this book. That just didn't work for me personally. I will say literary fiction can be very hit or miss for me. This was somewhere in the middle ish. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. I think that rating is based mostly on the high end, on the fact that I do think the topics he talks about in here are important, and I think he brings up important points about them. However, it lost points for sure, just in sort of being too much of all these strange things, and I just personally don't enjoy that. So you may get better mileage out of this book than I did. I would still recommend this book to people, especially if you're interested in reading a fictional work that addresses and looks at the issues of gun violence in the US. If you enjoy literary fiction and satire, as well as surrealism and magical realism all together, this may be something that is worth it to you. I will say the writing itself is pretty straightforward. All of those elements tend to come in with the characters and the plot more than the writing style itself. But definitely check content warnings because, especially nowadays and every day and every other day, I feel like here it may just hit too close to home for you. The next book I read just filled my heart with joy. There were so many things about this book that I liked, and that is Of Human Bondage. This is by William Somerset Maugham, believe is the correct pronunciation. That's just something that I feel like is hard to come off my tongue in general. However, that's the best it's going to get. I've worked at it. I worked at it because I care. This was published in 1915, and I think it's one of my new favorite genres, which is Künstlerroman, which I had never heard of. I've heard of Bildungsroman, which is the German word for a coming of age story. Apparently, this is a subgenre of that, which is the coming of age story of an artist, where you have a book that, at least in part, is not just a coming of age story, but also discusses the coming of age and the development of an artist of any type, not just like painter or whatever. Though in this case, our main character, Philip, does dabble in painting. This book is about Philip Carey, and we do get his life story. He starts out as an orphan who is raised by his very strict aunt and uncle, and he has a disability, which is that he has a club foot. And we follow Philip through his life and his loves and his art and his career as he struggles with being an orphan, with not truly feeling loved, with his own disability and his abilities, and just trying to figure out and make his way through the world. Philip's greatest desire throughout the book is really to go out and see the world, kind of have his own adventure. He wants to experience freedom and to be the master of himself, and also to just have the love that he never experienced as a child. However, this is all complicated by the variety of different obstacles he meets along the way, and we follow him as he goes through one form of bondage, if you will, of human bondage, and the next. And yeah, this story was so well done. It covers, of course, the topics of freedom and bondage, love, relationships, the meaning of life and love, as well as discussions of art and philosophical conversations with artist friends and those in sort of Bohemian Paris at the time, or living a Bohemian lifestyle in Paris in the early 1900s. The thing that I loved the most about this book were the meanings and the themes in it. I loved the conversations that were had in this book about philosophy, particularly those that Philip got in with other people his age in the artist community he was in at one point. But I also just really loved hearing Philip's own inner dialogue as he wrestles with the meaning of life, right? The deepest thing you can wrestle with in some ways. And it was just handled so well. I thought Mom did such a good job of bringing up these conversations and having Philip think about them with others on his own, but never losing sight of the plot while doing so, which I feel like is sometimes a problem and philosophical fiction. Like I'm thinking about Tolstoy, whose writing I absolutely love, but who isn't always great at like intertwining the philosophy into the actual story. I did not feel like that was an issue here. Every time it came up, it felt very natural. There were only a couple of scenes where Philip was like just sitting somewhere thinking his internal dialogue of like existentialism, and those worked really well for me. They were brief, they didn't drag on, and it didn't suddenly feel like a philosophical essay. So that was really good. There were some beautiful lines in here. However, the thing that kept it from getting a higher rating from me is actually the writing. I felt like there were times in this book where the writing style was just very basic. So I can say the upshot of that is that it's not a difficult read. But it also like bordered on the line of being cliche and stilted in conversations. I really wanted the writing to be more beautiful than it was, but it was just kind of like okay to good for me most of the time. When it was good, it was really good. When it wasn't, it was kind of like, well, I could have told you he was going to say that because that's the most predictable thing to say in that moment. So there was that. This is definitely not a book that you're going to revisit because it's full of like long passages of gorgeous writing. This is a book that you're going to revisit more because of the plot, the character. You do connect a lot with Philip, despite the times that he starts to sound like a psychopath, because there are some of those moments. Um, but you can't help but like him anyway. Is that really what I'm about to say? I don't know. Like you are frustrated with him. His anger maybe just goes further than yours will. In fact, I hope his anger goes further than yours will. I thought there were a lot of interesting sub issues that got brought up in this book as well, including and sometimes questionably issues surrounding other races. A lot of discussions in this book in the background have to do with class and classism, but there is a look at one point at other races when Philip encounters during his life someone who is Asian. There are some parts of that conversation that would be seen as outdated and could even be interpreted as racist. And I don't think that was the intent because there is a moment in that scene where there is one particular character who is very intentionally being racist. Um, it does seem like from Philip's viewpoint that he is as progressed in society, if not slightly more progressive in his thinking on race than those around him. But just do know that you may run into that at one part in the book and it may feel off. Really, you'd have to look at what the author's message is to truly understand that passage. But I do put that out there as a warning because I don't want that to shock anyone if they come across it and be like, whoa, what's going on here? I think it's a moment in the book you just have to read very carefully and closely. That said, I did end up giving this book a 4.5. I was really hoping it was going to be a 5-star for me, but there were just those couple of things that really kind of held it back and made me go, I don't know that this is that well written here. So there's that. I would recommend this book to anyone who loves a coming of age story, especially if you like stories that involve artists or art communities, that kind of thing. If you like philosophical fiction, I don't think I ever really see this mentioned as philosophical fiction. The entire book isn't per se, but certainly the main message and point and lesson of the book is on the more philosophical side. Again, it is fairly easy to read and straightforward. The writing style feels pretty modern, and it's a great character study. So if you like that, you'll probably like this book. And yeah, especially if you like romance and romantic relationships in your books. There are multiple relationships looked at in this book from multiple different angles. So that's also exciting to look at. I would say after David Copperfield, this is probably not my favorite book ever, but probably my next favorite coming of age story, which is saying a lot. I will definitely reread this book at some point in the future, and I feel like it's one that isn't mentioned that frequently. And I'm not sure why, because other than the writing just not being fantastic, it wasn't bad. It's certainly better than some other things that I've read, but I don't know. So if you have any thoughts as to why this book might not be that popular, let me know. And if you like this book as well, let me know that as well, so we can gush together. Every now and then, I feel like I'm out of focus, and I can't tell if it's me, the camera, if I just need to put my glasses on. I don't know. So if parts of this are out of focus, I'm sorry. I, I, I personally can't actually tell. Okay, the last book I have to discuss is The Mars House by Natasha Pulley. This was published in 2024 and is a work of science fiction. The Mars House tells the story of January, who is working as the principal in the London Theatre Ballet Company, and he's simply trying to figure out his next steps in his life as he is 31 and coming towards the end of his career as a dancer. However, he suddenly finds himself in a situation where he has to flee a flooding London and is given the opportunity to become a refugee of Tharsis, which is the colony that is on Mars. He decides to take the opportunity to go to Mars, as a lot of the other countries that are still inhabited on Earth are closing their doors to refugees. When January arrives in Mars, he finds himself in a very precarious situation where he is living as an underpaid refugee with no other job offers than to take manual labor work in local factories, and he very quickly finds himself with the difficult decision of deciding whether to go through the extremely painful and sometimes deadly process of naturalizing and adjusting to the Mars climate, or being forced to leave. All of this is being done at the hands of a rising star politician who just happens to be xenophobic. So this is a very interesting premise and setup for a book, and also very timely. This book discusses clearly the idea of refugees and citizenship, as well as xenophobia and politics surrounding citizenship status, and also looks at the idea of colonizing other places, and clearly there's a bit of climate fiction involved in this work as well. This is a book that I am reading as part of the sci-fi fantasy book club that I am involved in, and I was very curious and interested in reading and discussing this with other people. So I'm excited that book club is coming up soon. In fact, may have already passed by the time you guys see this video. I'm not sure. I'm not going to try and figure that out. Anyway, the highs in this book for me were definitely the conversations surrounding citizenship. It is a conversation that I think Natasha Pulley handles pretty well, and she definitely does a good job of presenting multiple points of view, though the entire book is basically told from January's point of view, you do have him discussing and considering other sides as he's confronted with other views on what should happen with this citizenship issue. I think this book does a really good job of showing that it is a complex issue that is not easily resolved, even if some of the answers regarding it are pretty straightforward. I think it also does a good job of showing why people and how people come to different views and opinions on this. I think the discussions are really well done and go in depth without becoming overwhelming or using a lot of jargon to get into them. For me, the low, surprisingly, actually had to do with the plot. I sadly found the plot in this book very predictable. In fact, there's like a couple mysterious things going on in the background of this book that are obviously supposed to be like twists and that kind of thing in the story. There was only one moment in the book that I felt like, ooh, I didn't expect that or see that coming. Everything else in the book seemed so obvious to me that it actually started making the protagonist appear stupid because it was like, how do you not realize this is going on? And in fact, there was one issue that made everyone in the book seem stupid because it just seemed kind of ridiculous that no one was questioning some of the things that were happening. I found that really frustrating because there was an aspect of me that was really continuing to go because I was like, surely I can't have figured out in the first like 50 to 100 pages everything that's going to happen in the later in the book. Yes, apparently I did and could. Because of that, I give the book 3.5. I honestly think it would have been a 4 if not for that. It is a good book. The themes in here are really well done. It is an interesting plot and like setup in general. I just wish the foreshadowing had have been handled more carefully so that it wasn't such a dead giveaway of things. Anyway, I'd recommend that book to anyone who likes soft science fiction where like they're not getting too deep into how every little thing works. There are like sciencey and technical stuff, but like they very rarely talk about how any of it's working. It's just like this happens. There is some good political intrigue in this book, and it does talk about a lot of contemporary topics. So if you like those contemporary topics or are interested in reading about them in a fictional setting, this would work well for you. There is a well-handled romance in here that's kind of a slow burn. Again, I had some issues with it just in terms of like how realistic was it that they were truly falling in love. It did feel a little insta-lovey, so I don't know. But if you like a plot driven novel, this is also that. So it might be worth a try. So that's it. Those are the 3 books that I have finished since the last time I checked in with you guys. I am currently in the middle of Clarissa still, of course, and I am also reading Diarrhea of a Void, and I will probably finish that today. So you guys are a little bit behind, and that's not on my last TBR you saw, I don't think. I'm so confused. But I do have a new TBR coming out soon, if it's not out already. I'm probably the only one who's confused about all that. Anyway, that's all that's going on for me. Let me know what you're reading and how your reading is going in general, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye. Oh, and if you've read The Mars House, let me know. Did you figure that out early? Like, was it just me? I'm just really confused because that was the main part of the book I didn't like, was just that it was so obvious, that I was then in denial that it was actually that obvious. Anyway.